Welcome to the Mycelium Signal podcast. As always, I'm your host, Konstantin Tuonihovi. Please keep in mind that this podcast is a direct continuation of the first part of the conversation with Kyle Rasmussen of the American death metal band Vitriol. Please listen to the first part of the discussion before continuing with this one. You had a track called The Flowers of Sadism, and it deals with sadism, of course, and there was these lines. My blood has stayed in my mouth. The snake releases its own tail. My eyes pull and blacken as they thrill the mortal cell. Their dilation exhales the holy. This part brought me cold shivers down my spine because of its apocalyptic vision, and later in the lyrics there is fittingly this verse. Infernal focus tightens, an arrow of vision shot outside the periphery of God. Revelations flood glean the poppies from heaven. Its language is lost. Perdition blooms within me. The praise periphery of God brings to mind the notion that something evil is happening beyond God's oversight. Am I on the right track here?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Ties back into what we were saying about the insight of very, very extreme negative mood states, and there are many kind of initiations into this place. It doesn't necessarily have to be violent. In my case, it was. So I think that the alchemy of that, what I tried to do with that song was to tie it into what we were just talking about, the legitimacy of, if something is ever present and recurring, there's something truthy to it.
Yes.
I use colorful language, and that extends to the human experience, the internal human experience, negative emotion, right? We, in the same way that we push away members of our society that forces us to confront these aspects of ourselves, these more distilled representations of the negative aspects of ourselves. We do that within ourselves. We call it the devil, right? We call it, it's the way that, classically, religious people call it the devil. Secular people call it alcohol. Basically anything that makes the dark subconscious arise. Like we've cleverly convinced ourselves that like being inebriated makes us do bad things or something. It's like, no, it's the shit that you want to be doing when your persona isn't in the way, and you do dumb shit when you're fucked up because you don't deal with that shit. When I get fucked, I don't drink, but when I get fucked up on anything else, I just become like a big lover. If there's anything I'm holding back half the time, it's usually that. So that's what emerges.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. When I used to drink, I would get very aggressive, but I think that just happens with aggressive people that drink. But anyway, so that song, and really the album, is a bid for acknowledging not so much a celebration of those negative emotions, this sadism being the example here, but really like I don't want to say a defense either, because I don't think there's anything to defend. I think it's honoring the reality of it and the inevitable alchemy of the process that results in it, and that it is abscess on. I said earlier when we were talking about my family history that there are levels of resentment. You know, there are more and less legitimate negative levels of negative emotion, just like there's more and less legitimate levels of positive emotion. There are deeper depths of love. There are deeper depths of hatred. And I think a lot of real acts of violence, it's driven by a kind of pain that most people simply do not have the imagination for or the time or interest to try to understand. And we have the victims of the darkest parts of our world and our society, because we're too uncomfortable with it, are being martyred left and right. I mean, these are people that are dying spiritually, psychologically, and physically because we have not evolved enough as a species to accept the conditions of their reality. So they go and they shoot up a school and they kill themselves, or they become serial killers. They do, you know, we share our reality. We're social animals. If you're full of love, you're going to want to go share your love. You're going to want, when someone falls in love with a romantic partner, they want their friends to find someone like they did. It's instinct. But when someone who's full of pain wants to share that with people, I'm not saying it's okay to go and fucking shoot a stranger. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is there are reasons for that behavior that are much more sophisticated than that person just being a piece of fucking shit. And the longer that we embrace that narrative that these are just sick, fucked up kids that were just broken out the womb or something, the longer our kids are going to be shot. You know what I mean? It's like, it is what it is. If you want to embrace the idea that, we're all connected in some way, like a body, this is a part of our body that's rotting, it's gangrenous, and we're ignoring it because we think it's ugly and it smells.
Yes, Carl Jung himself actually said that the healthy man does not torture others. Generally, it is the tortured who turn into torturers. If you look up the personal history of any of these people who have committed these kind of mass shootings and atrocities, school shootings specifically, for example, in Finland, it seems like they are finally starting to get it that school bullying has been probably the background case in many of these Finnish school shootings, which we have had a few in the last, say, 10 years now. And you have had like an epidemic of school shootings in the States and other mass shootings as well. I really think it would be very, very healthy for society to understand the mechanisms which might be quite ugly and unwanted and heal them in order to avoid these things happening all over again, because it also seems they are like trends, this kind of amok run, like somebody runs amok. It seems like a dark trend or something which is spreading.
Well, I don't think it's I think we can all see
it's a global trend.
The links between this. Social media has done a number. Social media has done a big number, and we are just starved for intimacy. And I think, this is why metal is so important. I think that this is the only place, the only established culture where those kids that are experiencing the limits of adversity can go and be honest about their experience and to actually find a little bit of romance in it. And that's so fucking valuable as a young person, to find a little bit of romance in your identity and your experience. And that can be dangerous, but lots of necessary things are dangerous. And kids in those situations that are in inescapable environments, if you want to take that away from them, go fuck yourself. Go live their life for a year. And it's the one place where we're allowed to fucking pull the curtain back and say, this is fucking real. This is really. I think if it weren't for discovering extreme metal, I would have been a much more dangerous person. And I'm not trying to say that to sound like any way. I have no stock in sounding intimidating or anything like that. It's just a fact of the matter. I was very hurt. I am very hurt. I'm still a very hurt person. Very alone. Very angry and very comfortable with violence, and that is an extremely dangerous combination of qualities in a person. And if it weren't for me finding that kind of like tribeless tribe of metal, a place where everyone was alone together, it was. And I don't really believe in like, brothers in metal or whatever. Just because you're into fucking blast beats doesn't mean we have a ton in common. But if you're there for, like meeting Nas was a really good example for me of like finding, like we don't, we're both, neither of us are like the most social people in the world. So it's not like we're constantly yakking it up on the phone, but the kind of kindredness and camaraderie I feel with him is among the most potent of anyone else I have in my life. And it's through what extreme metal and black metal means to us that it was my connecting with him did a lot to validate my relationship with metal as a spiritual siren song, because the commonalities that I guess in my most optimistic estimation, my most optimistic estimations were still surpassed in terms of the extent to which I was able to relate. We all feel this goes back to the voiceless voice. Some of us more than others, but most of us have a sense of when we are more or less in our like core self. We find ourselves in rooms or activities where we feel more or less connected with ourselves. We might find ourselves in a room where we feel really, really fake and uncomfortable and like, this isn't me.
Definitely.
And we all know that. And then we might find ourselves in rooms where we feel like, it might be your childhood bedroom. It might be fucking lots of whatever, where you feel so in your essence.
Element.
You feel so natural and you feel so kind of seen. Maybe maybe your parent does that for you. Maybe your sibling does that for you. Maybe your childhood best friend does that for you. I kind of got that feeling when I started meeting people that were really connected to this stuff in a similar way. Even Cheyenne, you know, meeting him, it was just like, oh, dude, I feel like I could go spend a month abroad with him and have a great time. And we've only talked on video twice. You know, I can't, that's very rare. I feel that way about, you know, anybody. So it's, I don't even know how I got on this subject, but, yeah, it's cool.
I can really relate to that. And it's like this whole Mycelium Signal podcast is the fruit of this kind of, I call it the Mycelium network or Mycelium networking, in the sense that I have had very profound discussions with people who I have never had a live discussion before on this very podcast, and had this kind of eerie, even uncanny rapport with somebody whom I have never met. And in contrast, I would even say that most of the people I meet, and I have met hundreds of, maybe even fucking thousands of people because of my work for the last, say, 40 years now. And it's very rare, like you said, to find that kind of contact and rapport.
Yeah, it's
weird.
It's a great way to legitimize the inner voice, that wordless voice, because if you can, through experience, you can empirically determine that there is something that transcends language, the verbal communication. You know, there's a way in which we kind of sense our own, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
everybody kind of
Oh,
has this sixth sense when someone is in their tribe, you know, psychically, spiritually, whatever. And if you believe in that, and you believe there's something wiser than what we can just ascertain by having a verbal conversation, then it's not a stretch to believe that there are more potent things you can ascertain within yourself by listening to something that's not just your internal dialogue. Like there's stuff, there's truthy stuff in here that you can't kick up just by having a conversation with yourself and trying to work it out intellectually. And because anything that happens out here is happening in here. You know what I mean? Like it's all, you know, I think most of us, if we're listening to this podcast, agrees on that, you know, that the individual is a microcosm of everything else, you know. So,
yeah, like as above, so below.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're all alone and we're all together, and both of those things are true.
Yeah, I think this topic of being unmasked is very important, because in society it's evident that most people wear masks all the time, and some people don't even know that they're wearing a mask. And I think it's very rewarding to be in that kind of very brutally honest and in a good way environment when you can speak your mind and be understood. And it's quite fucking rare nowadays because the shadow.
It takes a very strong personality, not strong personality in terms of like abrasive or big bravado, but like a durable. I think it takes a wise, and honesty is very caustic to the ego. You know,
Yeah.
it's like, it's very damaging. So you have to be either profoundly wise or like have, for me, I don't think it was profound wisdom. It was a kind of a divine inclination towards self-destruction. And it was just this almost like sadomasochistic pursuit to like just get in there and fuck it up. You know what I mean? And I think a lot of young people that are drawn to self-destruction or even struggle with suicidal ideation, hopefully they survive long enough to realize that it's a symbolic suicide that their wordless voice is pining for. not a physical death, but a spiritual and psychic death. I think a lot of people that feel very disconnected with life have been told that life is something that it isn't, and they're too smart to believe it. But they don't have the resources to love what it is. My sister watched a nature documentary the other day, and she said, man, the real world is so brutal and depressing. And I said, it's brutal, but it doesn't have to be depressing.
Yeah.
With the right perspective. You know what I mean? And this isn't simply like a dark devil horn sinister position. I mean, this is something that the Buddhists, this was like the whole fucking point of Buddhism.
Yeah.
It was kind of like a radical, joyful participation in the totality of life. Just like a radical embracing of everything, that everything is perfect all of the time. Even when everything is awful, everything is perfect. It's just like
stoic mindset.
Yeah.
Of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have also said the road to self-governance is littered with identity-shattering revelations, revealing that we are not what we believe ourselves to be. And elsewhere, I think in Iblis Manifestations podcast, you said in relation, you're much worse than you think you are. We all are. And as an antidote, you offered this idea of being a black mirror. I found this refreshing and starkly honest approach. And I still remember I was in a local commuter train and I was listening to this said podcast and I was like, what the fuck? This fucking guy speaks so much truth that I have never, or at least in many, many years, heard this kind of brutal honesty. And I was stoked to kind of get to know you and get you on this podcast.
I'm very
So
flattered. Thank you.
elaborate on this because I really am very fascinated about this statement.
I mean, this is the whole for me, this is the whole point of shadow work is eroding the vanity of this kind of special vanity that we've embraced for so long, that we've built religions on. We've divorced ourselves from the natural world in the interest of preserving our ego. And through this generations of storytelling about what we are and the fluff piece we've been engaging in for generations, we have convinced ourselves that we're something entirely different than what we actually are. And I think that's what's responsible for all of the major social crises that we're facing, is our expectation to reality gap is far too wide. And we don't have an imagination, a sufficient imagination for our own evil, And when I say we're so much worse than we think we are, what I mean is that when we are not engaged in dialogue with our shadow and we are not riding our demon, we're not negotiating with it, we're not focusing it into something meaningful. At risk of you might have to help me get back on track here because I'm going to segue into something else real quick, but just as a tying in as an example of someone who was able to, I think someone who was very in touch with their shadow, that focused it into something else. is Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler. I think why he is such an important character historically and still considered to be a hero of his culture is that this was a man that endured almost fictional levels of cruelty and abuse. He had one of the most incomprehensibly tragic lives and upbringings. And it turned him, just like the natural alchemy, you put in a certain energy and you get a certain energy out. It created someone who had an insatiable appetite for the suffering of others.
Yes.
But he was also a man of deep, deep conviction and had a very rigid codex. And he was able to focus all of that sadistic energy into efforts protecting and defending his country. He did not terrorize his own people. And I find it impossible to believe that he didn't wrestle with a strong desire to do so often. So I think that now if he was unable to have a conversation with that part of himself, I'm sure he would have probably killed himself. If he wouldn't have killed himself, he would have been destructive in a very purposeless way, in the way that we see a lot of young people being destructive in a purposeless way. So getting back to my point, if you're not making an effort to understand those parts of yourself, they are going to animate you. They're going to govern your behavior, and they're going to make you do things that are much worse than what you would have done if you confronted that part of yourself and had a respectful conversation with it. And that's because nobody's really doing that. Most people are not doing that. All of those parts of their darker self are making them be real shitty,
Yeah.
to use colloquial language. So it's inevitable. It's just like a product of it. If you don't do the work, the animal is going to work you. It's the shame in its afterbirth. The howl of instinct haunts, but ghost casts no shadows. If it were a ghost, if this instinct was just an abstract idea, if it was just this thing you could repress within yourself, if it's something that you could just hide in the basement of your mind, it wouldn't be trailing behind you. You wouldn't be able to see its body. It's the animal that stalks lives in your step. It's right there. It's in you. It's inescapable. And without bringing it into yourself, that chaos, the Jekyll and Hyde, I think, is a great allegory for the reckoning of the dark subconscious. The story about the doctor.
Divided.
Yes, this divided, fractured self, this radical cognitive dissonance. These two parts of yourself that are so separated, one that is the animal, one that is all the feral desire, all of the carnal qualities of the man. And then, of course, the doctor is very socialized, refined, well-spoken. It's a sophisticated allegory. It's a sophisticated metaphor, for what happens when we lose touch with ourselves through an overly socialized modernity.
This is very fascinating, and You actually kind of answered a question I skipped because I moved on, but I'll just recite my question. You don't have to answer to it anymore, but I think this has quite similar points. It went like this. Do you think sadism might come from this deep-seated need for revenge or a craving for some sort of reckoning that never got fulfilled? Could it also be that it's a way for someone to try and take back control or power over their past traumas? It's like their resentment is so tangled up and buried that they don't even know where it comes from anymore. And then their sadistic tendencies just latch onto whoever or whatever happens to be around, making them the target.
Yeah. I think all of the above. I think the reclamation of power is more of a product of the former, which is this kind of transmuting of injustice, right? I mean, it's something that we don't like the word vengeance here or retribution. We like retribution more, but revenge, vengeance, we that's a. But we all believe in it. You know, everyone's legal system is based on this premise. You know, if anyone who tells themselves that any judicial system is about purely rehabilitation are catastrophically naive. You know,
Yes.
we have there's a part of us that will always have a tit for tat attitude, and I think there's something very right-headed about that. I even think that our what we spoke about earlier, about my lyrical work, my kind of inborn animosities and hostile skepticism toward the things that I was. I do. It's at this point in my life, it is very difficult for me to believe that was not in some way inherited, and if that can be, to me, I mean, I don't know if you can have more of a divine argument for that kind of an emotional experience. And I think it's really like like I said earlier in this conversation, an imbalance that is yet to be balanced,
Yeah.
And an imbalance that is yet to be rectified. And so in that way, I think sadism is perfectly legitimate. I think it something is looking for release, something is looking for and that manifests in the physical world as power. You know what I mean? That the tat for the tit is an exercise of dominance, but it's not really the point. I think the point is the point is a closing of a loop. It's it's balance. It's seeking balance, and that requires an exertion of power. But I think it does an injustice to those. The way people often attribute most of these acts of violence as just kind of like a reach for the fulfillment of some power fantasy, I think is not the case. I think it often can be, but there are also very good reasons to want power.
Yeah, it's like an evolutionary thing in the sense that I think people, as we are descended from apes, it's like we are violent and we are power hungry. And if you just would think or like act otherwise in a societal level in some kind of utopian society, you just make room for other people who are more enabled to get power and be more violent, and then you
Yeah.
will have very fucking ruthless society, as we probably saw in the last century in different places in the world. And it came to my mind that a Finnish brain researcher, he had this book which was translated to be evil in Finland, and he had a very how would you say, clinical and non-moralistic takes on these kind of darker evolutionary psychological mechanisms. And he actually said that even the blood revenge vendetta was kind of a primitive justice system,
Yeah.
So there you have it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think as someone who believes a lot of the primitive ways were more right-headed, I'm very comfortable with primitive vengeance. Yeah, I mean, I think if I probably would have engaged in more of it myself if I grew up in a different time.
I understand. To sum up this sadism chapter on this podcast, it's basically just another unwanted thing which has existed from the since of dawn of mankind, and it will probably exist. And there would be a good idea to kind of understand where it comes from and not to be too bit moralistic about it, because it is what it is.
It is what it
People
is.
are. Yeah.
It is what it is. It's not going anywhere. It's here to stay. It's your roommate. Deal with it.
Yeah.
And, like what you said about, if you try to relinquish the power, then someone else is going to come in. Someone says, if you want to say that's cynical, you're naive. And it's like a great line in the new album that ties in well with this truth, in my opinion, is the fires of self are never extinguished, only displaced.
Yes.
We can't kill the demon. You know what I mean? Love doesn't kill the demon. Love dances with the demon.
Yeah.
Love is copulating the demon. That's not the point. They're bedfellows. The point is to make both of them your bedfellow. And if you reject the demon, that demon it's not going anywhere. You're not going to get it out of your house. It's just going to go into the next room and burn it down. So and as we discussed earlier in the podcast, as above, so below. If that is true within yourself, is true without, if the individual is a microcosm of humanity as a whole, then the same goes for us as a society. Every time one of us relinquishes our relationship with personal power, agency, autonomy, even a relationship and capacity for violence, a relationship with and the capacity for violence, we are forfeiting our power. It's like voting. You're forfeiting your mental footprint on shaping the psychic reality of our world and our society, right? You're familiar with the concept of the egregore?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Glad you brought up.
So like this concept, you're opting out of feeding your egregore. And I think it is everyone's, for lack of a better term, God-given duty. Like as far as I'm concerned, the closest thing, and so far, and I have a long ways to go, so I'm sure it'll change, but the closest thing I can understand to someone's purpose in life is to listen to that voiceless voice and feed your egregore. Like that's your job, is just to live in that space, cultivate that space, explore that space, commune with other people that are exploring that space. That's your job.
Definitely. This brings to my mind, we don't have to go into this topic because I have discussed this before in this podcast, but there is this Tibetan Buddhist practice of feeding your demons. I think it's based on the church ritual, which has this idea, I believe, that the shaman or the practitioner would deliberately let himself or herself to be fed by angry demons in order to find some kind of ritualistic wholeness. But I believe this is something we have been discussing with different terms. But I have a interesting thought experiment here. This is based on your original ideas and your original thought mixed with my own insight. So I'll throw it right back at you. So it goes like this. We use our persona, which stems from the ancient Greek theater masks, subliminally or deliberately to interact with each other. Our recognizable physical forms or our shapes and faces are a big part of this. They help us to connect, communicate, and understand each other, forming the basis of our said reality. And we show different sides of ourselves in different situations. For example, you might act one way at work and another with a close friends or family. Now imagine if we could see each other's true, raw, psychic forms without any masks. This would change our interactions profoundly. Trust would become more complicated because the polished exterior of someone might hide darker thoughts. For example, your philanthropist, nerdy neighbor could be a closet serial killer, or spouse could have a secret side hustle in black market organ trade.
Yeah, yeah. Good. Yeah, you could be
Yeah,
married to Dexter. Who knows?
yeah. I got this idea from something you said. I probably forgot what it was, but I think this was a good bit in this part of the interview. And we can now get more into the Black Mirror or the Monstrum. And that is of the enemy or opposition. And you have said, and I'm paraphrasing here, some people don't feel rage, good for them, but some people have enemies. And I actually had to re-listen this again, and it was such a striking statement. You didn't perhaps specify if these enemies were external or internal, which brings to my mind the concept of monstrum, the monster. I think it's quite related to the shadow, but before we move on, here's a brief rundown on the subject. The term monstrum in the Jungian context often refers to the embodiment of the grotesque, the uncanny, and the horrifying aspects of the human psyche that we typically deny or fear to acknowledge. It represents a primordial image of the adversary that challenges our ego but also holds the key to the personal transformation and integration. By confronting the monstrum, our monster within, we engage deeply within our own shadow, uncovering and reclaiming the disowned parts of ourselves. So, how do you perceive the interplay between facing this monstrum and the broader process of integrating one's shadow? And you have probably, we have discussed this before, but if you have some original thought to add.
Yeah. For me, I think it's one of the. I'll start here. I'll start by saying that I was a very, very fearful young man. I would say it's fair to say that I'm still a very fearful person. I'm very sensitive. I feel as though I perceive a lot, and that makes the world a very overwhelming place for me. Anyone with a mature understanding of bravery understands it's not the absence of fear, but a willingness to persist in the face of it. If you, in that way, especially as a young man, growing up around in an environment that championed traditional masculine values, being a very fearful person was a great source of shame for me. It really challenged my sense of masculinity, and it was something that, I mean, there's a reason why my first full-length album is called "To Bathe from the Throat of Cowardice." I mean, it's really about, we preach what we need, right? People don't, they're usually not attracted to a religion that has nothing to offer them. So for me, as a very fearful young man, I needed to join the Cult of Bravery.
Yeah.
I needed to balance those scales. So I became radically confrontational. Not necessarily, well, yeah, also with people, but in general, with ideas, with myself, as scared as I was, I would push that hard. To tie this into your question about the monstrum, is that I was very aware of the presence of that part of myself and of those around me. I grew up in an environment where if you find yourself in an overly, like, let's say, a religious, overly socialized environment, community, you're going to see people, their mask, like we're talking about, or
Yes.
we're talking about, their mask is going to disproportionately represent one side of them, which is the syrupy positive side. Now, when you find yourself in a community that is very, let's say, to use a very extreme example, prison, right? You're going to see masks as well that are distillations of this side of themselves. I grew up more in that environment. So I got to see almost performative levels of the human animal. And being the combination of being confronted with the more harrowing aspects of being a person and being a hypersensitive and fearful young man was like the perfect kerosene and match combination to get me, and my desire coupled with my whatever was in my character, the fight or flight, I've always went with fight. So, and because of that, the potency of my fear now, this late in life, I understand was a really profound tool of spiritual enlightenment. If I didn't have that level of fear, I wouldn't have had the roadmap. I followed my fear. Like
Oh.
that was the pull. If I didn't have that dread and I didn't have the willingness to follow and pursue the dread, I wouldn't know the things that I know. And so if you don't see a monster and you're not afraid of the monster, and you're not willing to chase the monster even though you're afraid of him or her, you're going to have to find another road. And I'm sure there are. But for me, that adversarial position I had to the beast in man, because I wasn't always like this. I wasn't always like a celebrated and embraced this. This is where I am very far into a very long journey. And when I was younger, I really started out with a vilification of these things. I was more of a pearl clutching, like, how could you, like, I was sober for a very long time because I was surrounded by people who abuse drugs and alcohol to really radical extents and all sorts of stuff. So I developed a fear and a hostility toward these darker parts of the human experience. And through that journey, I was able to understand that part of the human experience and actually develop a lot of love and affection for it. Not in the way that, not in some cheap, degenerate way that makes me celebrate self-destructive things for the sake of it. But like, you once you're exposed to the important work something does, especially something that you feared for so long, like falling in love with something that terrified you is an ecstatic spiritual experience. It's like it's such a revelation of power and will and self-governance. Like to be able to take something that makes you fear life itself and resent life itself, and to hold it so close to you that it becomes like a brother. That's special. That's really special. And, I think that's, people can manage that. Like just, again, a line from the album, the ecstasy of power. What truer love? This a lot of, let's say, right hand ideology. It's this vilification of power. Power, in a sense, is the opposite of love, but whose love? Whose definition of love? And is it not the ultimate love and the sacrifice of something that is omnipotent to grant its child complete liberty? And to me, that's what that line means. What ecstasy of power, what truer love. The line before it is, God, if the, oh, fuck, what is it? You know my lyrics better than I do. I can't. What if if your sight blinds to the flight of the dove, what creature soars in her stead? What ecstasy of power, what truer love is gained in the human heart, something or other, the sacrifice of a human heart. The idea that the human heart being this notion of what a good person is, let's say, to put it in layman's terms, to sacrifice that idea of humanity, this thing that is absent, this thing that is disconnected from the demon, and that by reconciling yourself with the demon, the ecstasy of power that you will experience in that reconciliation, to me, seems like the truest expression of love for a conscious being. So, what ecstasy of power, what truer love? Like this idea that while power is often antithetical to our current concept of love, that I think it might be like a supra love, like in the same way that I feel like instinct of the greater is the superior intellect. I feel like spiritual liberty in that way is a truer love.
That's a fascinating take. I can relate to that too, and it brings to my mind something I wrote for this interview about Monstrum. It goes like this. What if the hero does not venture into the underworld, as in catabasis, to slay the so-called monster, but instead confronts and integrates his own shadow? Thus, what emerges from the so-called cave is not a triumphant Perseus carrying the head of Medusa, but rather a man-monster, a chimera. And I believe this interpretation is more thought-provoking and distinctly antinomian compared to the traditional dualistic good versus evil trope. It relates to what you just said about the ecstasy of power.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think this notion of slaying the demon is just genuinely misguided. Like I understand the impulse, but it's a stepping stone. You know, that vilification of the demon is where you begin. I mean, you'd have to be some kind of like almost, you know, Christ-like or anti-Christ-like figure to be born with this kind of wisdom. So it's like you have to, that's why I think fear is so instrumental, because you have no choice but to be afraid of this thing. You know, you're conditioned to be. So your only road to it is through embracing fear or tolerating fear. However, you got to get there. But the waters are dark and they're deep and they're full of unknown things. And it's like you have to have something in you that pulls you into those waters, that forces you into them. And I'm so grateful for being like a huge pussy when I was a kid. I say that kind of in jest, but like really, it was, and I also realized that fear, you can only be afraid of things that you see. And if you see a lot of things, you're just in a better position to be afraid. And I think a lot of the people that I grew up thinking were brave actually just lacked a lot of perception. You know, like they just didn't see the things to be, you know, fearful of. I'm not saying they can't then be brave in the face of that, but if you're not stupid or ignorant of something dangerous, a certain element of fear is going to be introduced.
Yeah, I think it's also important, like initiatory wise. And regarding to that, there's this interesting thing. Have you ever heard about the Freemasonic acronym of Vitriol?
Oh
It's
yeah.
about, yeah, I thought so. Visit the interior of the earth and by rectifying, you will find the hidden stone, which means that exploring one's inner depths and through purification and self-reflection, one can uncover hidden truths or the mythical philosopher's stone. In this context, it seems to me that you unearth the base material, a kind of credo in alchemy, from your own life and the suffering you've endured. And you've used this black substance to alchemically process it to create your own art, lyrics, and music. And a late post-Jungian psychologist, Sam Hillman, has said that the artist's task is to descend into the dark well of the shadow and bring back the light, the forms, and the images that reside there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Man, I wish we could share more about our future material because it relates a lot to this.
Oh.
But that's funny. So that actually totally, it's fun. Caught me off guard. That just really like very succinctly relates to something I was recently working on. But yeah, I think it's like, yeah, it's like a shadow pilgrimage, you know.
Yes.
And I think that it is those that are put on that path have an important job to do. And there isn't a roadmap or a college degree or something that society has established for that kind of person. The closest thing we have to that is metal music.
Yes.
I mean, it really is. I mean, it's really like, other than being like a niche philosophy teacher at some bizarre progressive university that would allow such a thing. You know, the best way to feed our egregore is making this music. And at the end of the day, that's really why I believe I'm doing what I'm doing. That's really why that when I was 6 years old, sitting in front of that boombox and my hair stood up on my arms, that was the beginning of something saying, you have a job to do, and this is the thread you're going to pull to figure out what that job is. and it was this.
Yeah, I'm a bit lost for words here because we are entering the final part of this interview, which deals with vulnerability and kind of the price of being a conduit for this kind of destructive but cathartic energies and processes. And so let's talk about the concept of wear and tear. It's an important point because, much like the death of loved ones, a part of us dies each time we experience loss. Time doesn't always heal all wounds. Considered analogy of a hard drive with bad sectors. A hard drive has only a limited number of spare sectors in reserve. Once those are used up, black sectors appear, which are like mines or potholes in a road. If the hard drive hits these, the operating system starts to malfunction. There is this adage that what doesn't kill you only makes you stronger, but what if you also get these kind of dead zones, which can then manifest as, for example, pitch black humor and other coping mechanisms?
Yeah, man. Very interesting. Yeah, I love that. I think this is why, even in commercial representations of things like black magic, there's at the forefront, there's always the theme of sacrifice. And nothing is without sacrifice. You know, like someone who, let's say, if you want to find some example of a diametric opposite, let's say we look at a fundamental Christian.
Yes.
They sacrifice a kind of agency throughout their life for spiritual purity, right? I think someone who's trying to engage in the stretching of the human being as a usurper to something, I don't know, some authority, let's say, whatever you want to call it, that currency is going to be your vitality, you know? And as someone that, like, weaponized loss is about this a lot, where it's this notion of using, like, transmuting this despair surrounding loss with brutal but effective coping mechanisms. And I miss everybody I've lost. There isn't a person that I've cut ties with. Of course, I miss everyone that's dead. Even the people I didn't especially love. But I also deeply miss the people that I just left, you know. That shit doesn't go away. If anything gets worse, you get more sensitive as you get older. But it's the price. I would be lying to you and your listeners if I said that there isn't a real fear that I might die from sadness one day. But I'm very committed to not. And I think it is, I really, really believe that it's a worthy battle to fight. And I think so long as I'm doing my best to document that journey honestly, and I can put them into pieces of art that result in conversations like this with people like you halfway across the world.
Yes.
If I die on a noose somewhere 4 albums in, like, what the fuck ever? What else am I gonna do? Like, die from a coronary?
Yeah.
Die getting fucking T-boned? And it's like, who gives a shit, dude? Like, if I died exploring the depths of human sadness, like, that's sick, dude.
Yeah,
Like, that's a
it's
noble death. That's like, who fucking, like, we've become so disconnected with the notion of an ascetic life, something that isn't just about the pursuit of joy or happiness or comfort. It's like, I don't really mind, like, I don't want to say I don't mind. I'm not trying to sound that cavalier. Like, I really don't like the idea of committing suicide. I really don't. I think it's, it's for some people. I don't, I don't like, for instance, like, I don't fault Salim from the Devil's Blood for checking out. I'm not like, you should have kept making records. You had good work to do. Like, he did. He listened to his inner voice, and that's what it said. But for me, my inner voice says, don't. I'm a stubborn guy.
yes,
It's essential. It's core to my nature. And there's a part of me, even though there's very few things I like about being here. There's just kind of this, like, almost juvenile stubbornness that still persists, where I'm like, you're gonna have to tear this out of my cold dead hands. Like, I'm not. If I live to be 100, I will fucking hate it here every day in my own way for 100 fucking years. But I'm not checking out.
I
Um,
understand.
I don't know how deep this hole goes. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how strong I am. You don't know until you're in there. That's why, I think Eric from Witain phrased this journey, the spiritual journey. He said, this road either ends in total triumph or utter catastrophe.
Yes,
It is all or nothing. It's high risk, high reward. If you think you're the kind of person that can weather the storm, get in there. If you don't make it, you don't make it. It is what it is.
this
Like,
is this
I
is
know, I know what road I'm on, and we're gonna see.
yeah. Nas, I think, said in my previous interview with him that you follow your diamond either to your bitter or fucking glorious end. And since we are at the end of this interview, I like to share a thought about what this thing we have been kind of circling on, including the shadow. I have called it myself the trauma gnosis, which kind of resembles kintsugi, a traditional Japanese art form which beautifully transforms broken pottery into unique pieces by repairing the cracks with lacquer mixed with powdered gold. This practice not only restores the item but also makes it more beautiful and meaningful, reminding us that our imperfections and experience add to the beauty and strength, if I put it poetically. And speaking of poems, I asked you previously that could you recite your own lyrics from the third track of The Suffer and Become, nursing from the mother wound?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I just want to say, I've always been really inspired by the practice of kintsugi, and
Oh,
there's a twofold reason why gold is such an important color for Vitriol. Like, very often, our logo on our merchandise will be gold. Our big giant backdrop when we play live, it's a gold logo. I always try to. Gold is an important color to me. The hardware on my guitar is gold. I wear gold jewelry. Some, the assumption could be just because I'm a fancy guy, but I also like the symbolic relevance of gold in my life is extremely high. Well, mainly because of the earlier example of how it relates to vitriol as a concept. This it doesn't only speak to self excavation and descending within your darkness to find the truth, to find the lumen natura, but to the violent process in which it happens. So That's why they also called vitriol the green lion, because sulfuric acid is green, and it was so ferocious. That's like one of the earliest alchemical depictions of vitriol is a green lion biting the sun, has the sun in its jaws, and
Yes.
this represents the destructive purification that vitriol offers. It erodes any non-precious alloy. So if you poured or you soaked gold, corroded or not corroded, but impure metal, impure gold, it will eat away everything that is not the most refined, most pure essence of that material. So that is the source of the marriage between these two concepts, is this erosion of what, and this is why it's so important metaphorically, because it frames self-realization as a deconstruction, not as a construction of ideas, but actually an eroding of the unnecessary or the erroneous ideas, right?
Yes.
So this is such a potent wisdom, because we often have the narcissistic tendency to think of things as we think of ourselves as a cultivating force. It's less flattering to think of ourselves as a destructive force. But you have to embrace destruction. Every great artist knows that you don't know a great piece of art by just making something great. You know it by destroying every imperfect version until you finally arrive at the optimal version. And the quality of an artist is not only measured by their level of hostility toward the imperfect product, but also their willingness to endure the self-failure, the gap between the realized perfection or, approximate perfection, and all of these series of rough drafts. Mediocre artists take it halfway, the greats take it all the way. But it's always through disdain. Nobody wants to say, it's not flattering to say that. We always depict the creative process in movies and whatever as being this like big explosion of inspiration and love. It's like, show me one. I've never met that artist.
Yes.
I've never fucking met that person. Every artist I know, any real artist worth their fucking shit, they sit in their room and they want to die 98% of the time because they think they're a fraud. Until finally they just rip the thing out of them, and now they're no longer a fraud, and even then they probably still are them. So it's if you can realize that actualization is really about tearing stuff down, you're on the right track.
Yeah.
Lots of stuff starts to fall into place when you embrace destruction. Another line from the song, in solitude I've discovered the purpose of destruction.
Yeah.
Anywho.
It was, I think, Alice in Chains later albums had this song, "In Your Darkest Hour You Strike Gold." So it's all about alchemical process, and it can be violent and it can be desperate. And like Nas said, that the diamond appreciates toil and hardship. You must bleed for your diamond.
Absolutely. You
Rise
have
to its level.
And it's what makes it fucking valuable. Any to put it into folky wisdom, any parent that tries to teach their child the value of $1, they're in their way teaching them the currency of sacrifice. And that sacrifice, we understand it in an economic way, but we have a hard time, which makes sense because we don't have a spiritual relationship with ourselves as a culture. right now. At the very least, a healthy spiritual relationship with ourselves. But yeah, we've failed to really observe and embrace the alchemical exchange between suffering and beauty. You know, even modern, I mean, there's so much data that's constantly coming in that's reinforcing the notion that this universe, this existence, whatever you want to call it, is governed by these bizarre divine contradictions. Like, we understand, brain science understands that the best way to develop pleasure in the brain is to pursue pain. You know, it's like, it's that everything works that way. You know, that the Stoics realized that the best way to stay connected with life is to meditate on death.
Yes.
You know, that's the whole, like, if you stay close to death, it's, you know, I'm exhausting my lyrics at this point, but they just all tie in so neatly to this. It's the line, and he will fight savagely. I shared it on Cheyenne's podcast because it speaks to this for me. It says, I know the aching of the end, and I will never be left by its desire for the death of all. It is by its mouth's pull that into life's most vibrant plains I am called. So it's this, you know, holding death, its inevitability, and even its desire close to you, and embracing it can really give you acts as above, so below, right? So the more intimate of a relationship you have with death, the more intimate your relationship will be with life.
Definitely.
It's just effectively science. It's not, you know, it's, you know, it's pretty close to empirical how that stuff works. So in that way, I think a lot of worldviews that have a darker lens can offer a surprising amount of peace.
Yes, true.
With certain things. Yeah. Catharsis is a better word.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anywho, would you like me to read?
Please go ahead.
My home now thief swollen, my mind made leaden with enemy songs. I walk with their weight to heed the confessions of the throng. Tired wounds endure time's moult and seep through the present's white. A threshing focus cracks the mirage, bruising truth upon the mist of its light. Stalwart in darkness, in vigilance, my fellowship decays. The crippled mule of divine brotherhood brays. I've donned disdain's burdening mantle. I've denied the christened bliss. Confrontation's flames pile upon me, whose raging licks faceted jewel of the abyss. Deeper now into precious darkness, to mine pain for its stones of insight. Mark me with its glowing iron that shines merciless at the breast of midnight. The heart must burn with what the mind fails to hold. My body moves with the memory of the all-animating fire. Forgiveness will not make of it a quiet martyr. So let vengeance boil and dispel grace's absolving mire. Stalwart in darkness and vigilance, my fellowship decays. The crippled mule of divine brotherhood brays. Deeper now into precious darkness, to mine pain for its stones of insight. Mark me with its glowing iron that shines merciless at the breast of midnight.
Thank you. That was beautiful.
Thank you for the opportunity.
This is a perfect epitome for this 3-hour interview at this point.
Yeah.
in a podcast which dwells on the deep, I think we kind of, in a good way, hit the rock bottom.
Yeah.
And I think I have to release this podcast in 2 parts because the subject matter is just so heavy and it needs to be concentrated upon to really
That'd be
like
fantastic.
grasp it. Like a good wine.
Yes. Yes. Well, this was such a pleasure, and I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to talk about this stuff.
This has been the Mycelium Signal podcast. Good night.